Good evening, everyone. It's such a gorgeous day outside. We're delighted to see you all inside as well for this very special evening. Our thanks to Credit Suisse for this wonderful venue and for hosting everyone. My name is Jeanette Wagner, and I'm a member of the board of the Foreign Policy Association, and it is a great honor for me to introduce Ambassador Platt this evening. It gives me great pleasure because Ambassador Platt is one of America's seasoned diplomats. He spent most of his career on relations between the U.S. and Asia, 34 years in the Foreign Service as U.S. Ambassador to Zambia from 1982 to 1984, the Philippines from 1987 to 1991, and Pakistan from 1991 to 1992, followed by 12 years as President of the Asia Society beginning in 1992, where I certainly had the pleasure of being very actively involved while he was there, and he was terrific. He became President Emeritus following his retirement in 2004. Clearly a man with vision, Ambassador Platt's involvement with Asia began as a student of the Chinese language in Taiwan in the early 60s and continued with Foreign Service assignments in Hong Kong from 1964 to 68, Beijing from 1973 to 74, Tokyo from 74 to 77. In 1972, he accompanied President Nixon on the historic trip to Beijing that signaled the resumption of relations between the United States and China. I can't believe it was that long ago. My goodness, 1972. He was one of the first members of the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing when the United States established a mission there in 1973. In the course of his government service, Ambassador Platt served in several capacities in Washington, including China Analyst, Director of Japanese Affairs, National Security Staff Member for Asian Affairs, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, responsible for politico-military relations with Japan, Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, Acting Assistant Secretary of State for UN Affairs from 1981 to 82, Executive Secretary of the Department of State from 85 to 87. Ambassador Platt graduated from Harvard College in 1957, earned an MA from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in 59. He's a board member of Scenic Hudson and of the Friends of China Heritage Fund Limited, as well as chair of the U.S. China Education Trust Advisory Board. Ambassador Platt and his charming wife, who's very smart also, Sheila, there in the front row, have 3 sons, Adam, a writer, Oliver, an actor, and Nicholas Jr., a financial publishing executive, and 8 grandchildren. His memoir, China Boys, was published last year. I'm very pleased to turn this microphone over to him. Ambassador Platt.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, and thank all of you for coming. This is the first time I've ever had 2 screens, and I'm so excited I can barely contain myself. The way this evening is going to develop, I'm going to show a movie that I made, a worm's eye view movie of the Nixon trip, the life in Beijing in 1973 when we opened our liaison office. And then I'm going to, that takes about 28 minutes. And I'm going to give a little introduction to the book and tell you what it's about. My security fell off, so I may not be able to leave. And then I'm going to open it to questions. And I hope that we'll all be finished by 7 o'clock. But if we're not, and everybody wants a drink, they can go and have one, and we can continue the Q&A after that, if you wish. You can be flexible. In any case. Those of you who attended Nixon in China, for those, this is a familiar scene. And you will be seeing, and you are seeing, the airport in Beijing on the day and the moment that Richard Nixon arrived. My vantage point was, and my position was very lowly, so I took the initial pictures from behind the engines, as you can see. There's Joe and Lai waiting for President Nixon, and everybody's wondering if Nixon and he are going to shake hands, and because John Foster Dulles had refused to do so several years before in Geneva, and the Chinese had never forgotten. But he certainly did, and he was very emphatic about it. That's a picture that just shows I was there. We then went to the Great Wall. These are some scenes from the visit. And of course, the Great Wall was manned by reporters. Bernie Kalb there. On a beautiful frozen day with the ice frozen in the trees, Nixon came. And the important thing about that was not only that he came, but that the whole scene was connected to the rest of the world by live TV. And that was really the most important thing about this trip, was the connection of China with the rest of the world. We went to the Ming tombs. Here's Pat in her red coat, which was an iconic garment. And we did these things very quickly. The children were well trained, and they did their thing. We went into the Ming tomb, and then we came right out again. But it was an important site. We then went to the Forbidden City on a snowy day, rather rare to have snow at that time. It was a dark day, but it gave the place a sort of a solemn grandeur. People didn't use shovels, they used brooms to keep the snow away. And you can see on this gray lowering day, the president arrives with his wife and is taken around to see what's happening and to see the Forbidden City. Nowadays, of course, the scene has changed a lot, and a lot of interest, a lot of people following us, keeping track, but in general, the place was empty. And if you take a look here, you get some idea of the size of the motorcade that went with Nixon everywhere he went. We were sort of in a bubble, in a cocoon. The Chinese were very interested, but we didn't get much contact with them. Here's Zhou Enlai, Nixon feeding the fish in Hangzhou, and Henry Kissinger is also there. The people who made all of this extraordinary opening happen. We get home, Nixon realizes he's really made an impact and had a great success when there's a gigantic crowd waiting for him at Andrews Air Force Base. He hadn't really expected, he took a lot of risks going to China, and a lot of things had not been fixed in advance. There's Sheila with her "where the hell have you been" look. And when I tell her, and give her a little present from China, she warms up. 14 months later, we are crossing the bridge at Luowu to go to Beijing and set up the liaison office, the first resident office in 2 decades in China, diplomatic office. These are the lowly delegation, me and my secretary and some security guards. There's the Beijing Hotel where our first offices were. A lot of you have been there many times since. It's changed a lot. We were looking at the roofs of the Forbidden City from our office windows in the Russian wing, and we had below us a courtyard into which we could peer and see what Chinese life was really like. This place has been filled in with a new hotel, but this was purely magic for us because we had no idea what Chinese did all day long. And here's a lady doing the laundry and a man going off to work and a lady brushing her teeth. All of this was a matter of total fascination for us. I'm sure they wouldn't be too happy to know we were taking pictures of all this, but for us it was the dark side of the moon. And here's a man doing his exercises. The kids are going off to school. Here's a little kid who's relieving himself on the pavement, and his through his split pants, and his grandmother has bound feet. And you don't see that anymore, I'll tell you. The Cultural Revolution is still on, and there's a poster, a wall poster. It's not the violent part of the Cultural Revolution. In fact, things are kind of calm for the ordinary person, but not for the leadership. This is the Liaison Office being built, actually being built. Those of you who've been in China recently know that this was the residence of Ambassador John Huntsman and all of the previous ambassadors and liaison office chiefs before them. My office is in a state of new construction. People's Liberation Army are guarding us alertly outside. And you can see the whole area where we lived and worked. This is the diplomatic compound of Zhenguo Manwai. It's a gated community. Chinese can't get in. We can get out. But we feel somewhat like inmates. And here are the inmates playing some volleyball. John Holdridge in the white hair on the right is one of the great pioneers of the relationship. And if you think pollution was a new thing, is a new thing in China, this is a view from our kitchen window in 1973. We could count more than 100 chimneys from factories there. There weren't any cars to pollute the place. Now, of course, they've taken over. The chimneys are gone. But this was a clear October day, and that's what it looked like. Now, not everybody lived in these new fangled diplomatic compounds. The Swiss had an old courtyard house, and I went to call, that's me, I went to call on my opposite number, and just to see what the old compounds looked like. This was down in the legation quarter. Now these are all government offices. We had our own trips to the Great Wall. We went to different places than Richard Nixon went. But it was fun all the same, because nowadays the wall is just teeming with people. We had always been taught that you could ride horses along the wall and patrol from horseback, but I kind of doubted that after watching Sheila negotiate these stairs. It would have been hard on a horse. Anyway, we did what everybody else used to do and still does. We went to the Ming tombs. Our children were there. They were known as Big Tiger, Tiger number 2, and Tiger number 3, Dahu, Arhu, and Sanhu. And Sheila and they took to China, found it an extraordinary place, got sort of used to it. There's Sanhu losing his shoe, Adam Dahu taking his picture, and Sheila reading Nagel's Guide, which was the only guide to China that you could get in English. We used to go to the Ming tombs ourselves, but we went to the Ming tombs that had not been excavated. And there were 11 of them, and they were charming states of decay. The Chinese didn't have any intention of digging them out. They knew exactly what was in there, and they were digging up more interesting things every day from dynasties that dated way before the Ming. Anyway, we'd take picnics. This is the time of the persimmon harvest in the fall in '73. And there's the transport, which is mostly horse-drawn, to get the fruit off to market. We'd have friends come through. We'd take them on picnics. We had this idea that Bloody Marys were somehow revolutionary. And so we used to drink those and toast each other. We'd go to the Forbidden City as well. And it was open to the public, but only sort of. As you can see here, we're going in with a family. An old lady who's sort of guiding us around. Place is empty. The buildings look sort of beat up, although I thought they were magnificent. And we enjoyed that place hugely. Nowadays, it's teeming with thousands of people every day, and everything is spick and span. We spent a lot of time on bicycles in Beijing in those days, because bicycles were a good way to get around. Not only that, but they were also the only place where the Chinese felt comfortable talking to us. They couldn't have conversations in the street. They'd be reported by their Revolutionary Committee members. Obviously, it's hard to shout anything out of a passing car, but in a bike, in the great stream of bicycles, which was the order of the day, people would come up and they'd strike up a conversation. Are you an Albanian? What are you doing here? Then we go back and say, well, we've just arrived and we're finding Beijing very interesting, and how much did those cabbages on the back of your bike cost, and so on and so forth. Anyway, for us it was a chance to get out of the bubble and out of the cocoon that the Chinese wanted us to stay in. This is a lane called Liulichang where all of the art was sold. And it's still there. It's been vastly fixed. This is a stunning action shot with me. You see my head down below. Pedaling with and steering with one hand and taking movies with the other, very dangerous. But we wanted to give people a sense of what life was like bicycling in the hutongs, in the lanes of Beijing in 1973. We also took picnics to the Western Hills. And the Western Hills were quite far away from Beijing in those days. That's no longer true. All of the space here that you see, empty space relatively, has been filled in with ring roads and buildings and scientific institutes and all of the things that go to make up modern day Beijing. There's a bird. There weren't too many birds in China in those days. And it was a kind of a bucolic, nice place to go. We also would visit places like the Temple of Heaven. And here you see the three tigers and their mother enjoying this scene. I had never realized that the Temple of Heaven was held up by American redwoods. And this is not something that the Chinese talk about very much. But in fact, when the building was rebuilt, cedars from redwoods in California were provided. What we're looking at here is October 1st celebrations in 1973. And they have a kind of a nice amateurish quality and a sort of populist quality, which is no longer true. Nowadays there's a big parade, and it's got to be perfect, and it's rehearsed, and nobody can see it except on television. But all of the parks were filled with people. There's little shooting galleries, people doing skits. Obviously the security men are there, keeping track of everyone. And here's another, making sure we're all safe. And here are people still wearing their Red Guard armbands. This is a big park in the middle of Beijing, and here's a PLA troop. So you see the throng of people there. These people are explaining the efficacy of Chairman Mao's thought. And they're having difficulty doing things. This young lady, of course, was having difficulty playing her instrument because she was so interested in what was going on. But he's having a hard time lifting this barbell. Now he arms himself with Chairman Mao's thought, and there it goes. So that was the kind of tenor of the time, and it was all, in those years, more playful. In the preceding years, it had turned absolutely deadly, as you know. Accompanying visiting delegations was something that members of the Liaison Office did, and I was in charge of sports and culture, which was very much a part of politics in China, and I was the political counselor in effect. And here we are in Guangzhou and Canton City on a hot June day with the rain pouring down and the American swim team just about to arrive. And here come the teams. And they are exhibiting the styles for which they are nationally famous. The Chinese are in serried ranks in beautiful uniforms, and we come shambling in under plastic raincoats. Oh well, that's us. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese and the Americans have together fashioned an extremely productive relationship, whatever their differences, and there's something, I think, very compatible about them. In the water, of course, we had a lot to say and a lot to teach the Chinese, although they learned it very well over the years and are now extremely good at all of this competition. But we were able to learn a lot about China. This was our first look at other parts of China, going around with these young people. This is the Pearl River in Canton, in Guangzhou, in flood, and a big raft coming down. And people, of course, sailed their junks in those days, and they lived in sampans. And these are pictures that draw gasps from young Chinese audiences in the universities where I've shown this movie before, because they have never really realized how poor China was. Here are the kiddies in a commune outside of Canton, and here are people going to work. That's Mickey King, who was the great diver of her generation. And these are just scenes from ordinary life. Actually, these are sort of approved scenes. And so there was a lot tougher things, a lot tougher standards of living in other parts of the country. This is Chairman Mao's house. It's his father's house, actually. And anyone who thinks that Chairman Mao came from poor peasant stock had better look at his father's house, because it's a very generous, big place. And he was a landed peasant who was what the revolution was all about and against. Here are some ships coming down the Xiang River near Changsha, being navigated the way they have been for thousands of years. This school, this is the first normal school in Changsha, was where Mao taught. It's now been created and turned into a shrine. It's well preserved. It's actually a nice piece of architecture, Western and Eastern mixed. Everything's well preserved. The well where Mao washed, the spittoons, everything is carefully preserved. This is Shanghai in 1973 at the confluence of the Suzhou Creek and the Huangpu River. And you can see the black Suzhou Creek from inside the country emptying into the gray Huangpu River. That's Pudong across the way. That is Pudong. And those of you who have seen the great skyscrapers of Pudong know now what it looked like before they even began. This is commune life in the Shanghai area. Very common. 80% of the Chinese people lived on the land in those days. They're trying to get it to 40% now, and it's causing a tremendous amount of growth and also a lot of angst as well. These are just shots of family life in these in a prosperous commune in the area of Shanghai. Here are some young Red Guards who'd been sent down to the countryside, now coming in for lunch, with their elders all coming in long, disciplined lines from the fields. Now, we had other extraordinary visitors. This is Eugene Ormandy, and we had an extraordinary time organizing his trip, bringing the Philadelphia Orchestra to Beijing and Shanghai, getting into arguments with Madame Mao's forces, flying frisbees. Madame Mao wanted Ormandy to play Beethoven's Sixth, and Ormandy didn't want to play it. My job was to talk him into playing it, and I'll explain how I did that later on. A lot of it was made up, but it worked. Anyway, he did play it, and she loved it, and the visit went off very well. But he was a marvelous conductor, and I really had a first-hand experience. He and his Chinese counterpart led the same orchestra in the same piece of music back to back, and the difference was just extraordinary. Philadelphia Orchestra has just declared bankruptcy, but it's very anxious to continue its work in China and is determined to do so. And I'm spending some time trying to help them do that. Here we are going up the Huangpu River on a boat with a lot of Chinese virtuosi on traditional instruments. This is the one place where I really wish we had a soundtrack, because these people could play marvelously well, and they were deeply admired by everybody in the Philadelphia Orchestra. Very spirited. This man would make Jean-Pierre Grandpal envious. Now, when there weren't delegations visiting, we turned into one ourselves. Here's the Platte family, the three tigers, and Sheila on their way to Wuhan in July. People said we were crazy to go to Wuhan, the hottest city in China, in the hottest month of the year. And perhaps we were. But we were so curious about what the rest of the place looked like that we would take anything that came along, and they said, well, you can go to Wuhan. And we said, fine, we'll go. The Chinese didn't have a clue what to do with children who were traveling. And we said, don't worry about that. We'll just be a delegation. You know how to deal with delegations. This is a delegation. This is the Platte family delegation. We have a young member. We have another older member who will ask questions about labor practices and so on and so forth. And we'll see anything you want us to see, because this is what we are here for. The place, this is how people got goods back and forth across the Yangtze in those days, across the Great Bridge. It's all done by hand. There's a man and a donkey in harness together. Actually, the donkey wasn't doing very much. The man was doing everything, but schlepping things up and then roaring down the other side of the bridge. That was the way things got done. This bridge, of course, was a great feat, and the Chinese were very proud of it. Here's our family delegation growing a crowd. All that had to happen was that the people on the street, moving on the street, any block, would stop, and you'd have about 3,000 people. And there's Oliver, who has since made about 60 movies with one of his first crowds. Well, they said, we'd like you to go to the number 2 Wuhan Iron and Steel Works, the second largest steel works in the country. And we said, fine. Going to a steel mill and a blast furnace in the hottest city in China, in the hottest month of the year, didn't strike us as being too onerous. And in fact, it wasn't. It was definitely hot, though, I'll have to say that. But the delegation performed very well and went to see all the sites, molten metal being poured, almost white hot. Sheila leading the delegation, members scampering up and down, wiping themselves with towels, and the next place we went to visit was the teaching hospital in Wuhan, and they wanted to show us the efficacy of acupuncture as an anesthetic. Now, this is viewer discretion is advised here. But this lady was awake, behind a screen, her head behind a screen, and they were taking a great big goiter out of her neck. And in her body, at various places, were a bunch of different needles, all attached to electrical devices, impulses that were going through her body. And she was being tended by people who were saying comforting good things. And there's the goiter, and there's the girl. And she looks quite relaxed. She's relieved, of course. She leaves, waving and saying nice things about Chairman Mao. There are some, and were some, real tourist spots in China. This is West Lake in Hangzhou, which was where the poets, famous poets, for thousands of years all got drunk and wrote poems. And storks flew across the moon and other things. And here's everybody else going behind a red flag on a picnic. That seemed to be the way one did things in those days, everything behind a red flag. This is the oldest bridge that people know about, man-made bridge. It's called the Precious Belt Bridge. It dates from about 900 AD. So this is the confluence of the Grand Canal and the Suzhou Creek, the other end of which you saw in Shanghai. And again, another look at the way things were transferred to and fro by sail, by oar, so forth. Here are some pretty hanks of wool being made into rugs. Maybe our favorite thing as diplomats in China, recreation was going skating. Here's a diplomat taking his first very cautious diplomatic steps. And our children love to pretend they were playing hockey. And they love to fall down. And the Chinese thought this was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. And I think it's not unusual. I mean, most slapstick humor involves people falling down. And we satisfied that requirement. The Chinese, we gathered a crowd of Chinese all interested in this. And here's Oliver and Adam doing an act of their own. They made this up on the spot because they wanted to appeal to the crowd. And this is all a fake, but they had a lot of fun with it. The Chinese thought it was hilarious. And young children would come along on their ice carts. And their ice carts are just little platforms on skates. And they would do graceful banks propelled by their little ice picks. And this child is now banking into the sunset, where all good movies end, as the sun sets. So can we have the lights up, please? Well, this book, China Boys, is really the transition between then and now. And this talk is really about China then and now. And so I want to explain a little bit about it. It's a personal memoir, but it involves a lot of descriptions of real policy and real decisions, again, from the point of view of a staff officer who is just trying to get along and make things work and so forth. I wanted to read you a little bit from it, which explains what it was like to be close to Richard Nixon in those days. This book covers my decision to go into diplomacy, learn Chinese, Sheila's decision to go with me, also learn Chinese, what we were as China analysts, how the trip went, what the politics were of music and sports, and a whole range of other things. But it starts with the only time that I ever got close to Richard Nixon. I spoke with him for the first and last time on February 28th, 1972, at the day that the Shanghai Communique was issued. I arrived early for a meeting at the official guest house. The president was sitting in a flowered silk dressing gown over an open collar shirt and trousers, a long fat cigar in one hand, and a tall scotch and soda in the other. He looked drained but satisfied with what he had accomplished. What an extraordinary looking man he was up close. Huge head, small body, duck feet, puffy cheeks, about 3 walnuts apiece, my notes indicated, and pendant jowls hanging down, the entire combination exuding authority. Secretary of State William P. Rogers, my boss, came in. H.R. Haldeman was already there, hair close-cropped, yellow legal pad and sharp pencils close to hand. Henry Kissinger was nowhere to be seen. Assistant Secretary Marshall Green and John Holdridge from Kissinger's staff arrived a bit later, and the discussion began. These men, the leading Asia experts in the U.S. government, were leaving on a tour of Asian capitals the next day to explain what Nixon had accomplished in China during the past week. Nixon did virtually all the talking. He shaped the individual approach our experts would take with each leader at every stop, based on his own knowledge of the issues and the personal relationship with that leader. Tell Marcos I said this. Make sure Korean President Park understands the following. Japanese Prime Minister Sato must bear in mind that, etc. He had a personal message for each. And he predicted a generally favorable reaction from Asia's leaders. Only Taiwan had reason for disappointment, he said. However, Chiang Kai-shek could be confident that we would maintain our security commitment. Anyway, he concluded, where else could he turn? The president implied from his remarks that he was well aware of the difficulties his China visit would cause the Soviets. Well, Nixon's performance was a tour de force. It was close-up confirmation of his repute as the great foreign policy president of his time. The experts were not advising him what they should say. He was telling them. And as the meeting came to an end, he made a point of thanking each of us for our work. Secretary Rogers introduced me to him as one of the new China specialists at the State Department. And I told Nixon that I'd spent 10 years preparing for this trip and was grateful to him for making it happen. He accompanied me to the door of his suite, placing an avuncular flowered arm on my shoulders as he went, shoulder. Well, he said as we reached the door, you China boys are going to have a lot more to do from now on. Hence the name of the book. I could go into a lot more detailed readings and so forth, but I think time is a-wasting. So I will say this, I gave a copy to Dr. Kissinger, who told me several months ago that he couldn't finish his book unless he'd read mine. That's what he said. Oh, I was flattered with that. But I said, I happen to have a copy here, Henry, and let me just give it to you. And he asked me what the thesis of the book was. And I said, well, the thesis of the book is that the nuts and bolts of the relationship, trade, travel, investment, culture, sports, legal issues, and so forth, the nuts and bolts to which the State Department was supposedly relegated. We were all quite happy to be relegated to it, myself, became the relationship ultimately. The International Balancing Act between the Russians and the Chinese and the United States, which had been the strategic imperative which had begun this relationship, was over in a relatively short period. But the kinds of relationships that you saw just being formed in that film, between swimmers and orchestras and traders and CEOs and other visitors, grew over time into an enormous structure, an enormous structure of people-to-people links, which were strong enough to hold the relationship up when it was severely threatened. One, by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which removed the strategic imperative, and two, by the tragedy at Tiananmen, which put our relationship into a slide for some time. But the people-to-people daily things that we do together, the slouching Americans and the rigorously disciplined Chinese, have formed one of the biggest economic relationships the world has ever seen, and has helped to create one of the biggest economies the world has ever seen. And now, not a day goes by when there aren't 5,000 people in the air going back and forth between China and the United States, taking care of daily business. They're not all going on government missions or whatever. They're buying things, they're selling things, they're making things, and so on and so forth. So Henry Kissinger said, that's good, I think I'll steal it. And I wonder, I read the review of the book that came out today in the Times, and it didn't really say anything like that. But we'll see. I'll give it a careful read. So I think I'll stop right there for the moment. We have a few minutes for China now, and I'd be delighted to take your questions and to have you structure the discussion on current issues. So I have already a hand in the very back. Please, whatever the rules are here, state your name and...
Good evening, and thank you for being here. My name is Tim Spees, and I'm a partner with Eisner Amper LLP here in the city. What's your sense of the current views of the economics between China and the United States? Piracy, intellectual property, alleged theft, non-allowance of like-minded either technology or production in China by non-Chinese or other countries. Is it overblown, or do you think it's somewhat accurate?
All those issues are there. The closer you get, the more you rub, The relationship developed in an unbalanced way, with much more trade coming in this direction than going in theirs. The result was that they developed a lot of reserves, and they're accused of having kept their currency artificially low so that they could maintain jobs and earn more money and so forth. And this has become a major issue between us. And there's no question but that the economic relationship is unbalanced between the two countries and has to be rebalanced. And I think that we'll be able to do it. It's going to take quite a long time. But in the meantime, it is a huge relationship that works, that goes on every day. And we complain about each other all the time. There have been times when it's been relatively smoother than others. The Hu Jintao visit, this most recent one, kind of reset the relationship, and it's on more of an even keel, with both sides being extremely candid with each other about what's upsetting them about each other. But it's alive, and it has created a situation which we all have to be aware of, which is that for good or ill, China and the United States are stuck with each other. I mean, if you want to have China as an enemy, that can be arranged. But there's really no point. People say, are they going to sell all their bonds? They've got $1.5 trillion worth of U.S. treasuries. Well, why would they do that if that simply just drove down the value of their holdings. We're intertwined now. We're intertwined. And it's not a bad place to be. As Alexander Haig said when we were talking about the difference between confrontation and cooperation, well, he said, the safest place in the ring is in a clinch. And I guess that's where we are. Yes.
Ellen Easton, Red Wagon Press, off the record. With the tenuous relationships that we now have in the Mideast, America to the with the U.S. relationships to the Mideast being somewhat fragile, and the Chinese population embracing the consumership of cars, how do you see our relationship with the oil for America versus oil for China?
Well, there's been a lot of competition for natural resources as the Chinese economy has grown over time, and it has driven the price of commodities, raw materials, and fuels and oil and so forth up and up as it's going along. The Chinese have to pay the same price as everybody else, but we all have to pay more as a result of the demand going up. Just in the last week, you see commodity prices beginning to come down as the Chinese are trying to slow their economy because they're worried about inflation. And so the demand for copper and the demand for iron ore and things like that has gone down. And the world economy is very intertwined. And when the Chinese have now grown to such a size so that when they stop consuming something as much as they had in the month before, the people who supply it feel that. And likewise, people who buy their things also feel that. So it's real. And I think everybody's trying to figure out ways of not using oil so much. The only real alternative to oil, though, if you're looking at density and the size of the problem, is nuclear power, and that has been set back by what's happened in Japan in the last couple of months. Yes, sir.
I noticed in your biography, my name is Larry Bridwell and I teach at Pace University in the MBA program. Notice in your biography you spent some time in Pakistan. And I'd be interested in your forecast of Pakistan 5-10 years from now and the relationship between the United States and Pakistan.
Pakistan is more stable than it looks. It's been going over the abyss, going over the falls and so forth ever since I can remember. But it's never actually gone over. So I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why Pakistan holds together and why it is relatively, what are the elements of stability. And if you've had some experience in South Asia, you've seen pictures, traditional rafts coming down the Indus River that are essentially a collection of blown up cow skins stitched together, held together by a framework of sticks tied with string. Holds a lot. And each of these cowskins represents a different area of Pakistan. Punjab, Sindh, Karachi, Northwest Frontier, Baluchistan, so forth. The Northwest Frontier part is leaking badly, but the others work fine. And they're not going to take orders from any Pashtuns, any of these mountain men. That's just not in the societal and cultural mix. So the raft is held together by the sticks, which are the army, is not going to sink. It's going to bump along, and people are going to worry about it. 10 years from now, it still won't have sunk. And our relationship with Pakistan is probably, if we're if we're smart and patient, going to be better than it is now. It behooves us to have a relationship with each other. Our interests are very tightly linked. And despite all of the discomfort that goes with the current developments, we're going to get through this. Pakistanis are expecting us to go away. We've gone away 3 times. And I think it behooves us not to go away this time and to hang in there. Yes, sir.
Yes. We noticed today that there are stories in the paper about China cracking down on dissident writers, not allowing them out of the country. What do you think the prospects are for China evolving to a position of greater freedom and democracy, both for artists and so forth, and politically?
I think the prospects for China becoming a freer and more open place with a government that is more responsive to what the people want are quite good over the long run. Right now, the Chinese government is running scared. They are worried that somehow the Jasmine revolution that's sweeping through the Mideast is contagious, and that their own people are going to get this kind of disease. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese people have been expressing a desire for more rule of law, for a more responsive government, for better solutions to a lot of the problems that have emerged as a result of the stresses of modernization and urbanization for a long time. And they have good ways of expressing this. And while the internet is itself controlled, it is not, in the final analysis, controllable. But the Chinese government learns as much about what the Chinese people are thinking through the internet as the Chinese people express to the outside world. If you look at the history of the Communist Party's rule, you'll see that at key junctures, as they emerged and developed, and the economy developed and so forth, they made significant concessions to popular demand in order to keep the economy going and keep things moving. And I think the chances are pretty good that they're going to have to do that again. Most of the cognoscenti in the China-watching world says the Communist Party cannot survive a year of negative growth. And that may well be true. But they've been having a lot of growth lately, and it's causing a lot of problems and stress and so forth. And so they have to somehow thread the needle between the desires of the people, which are also to get rich and to be stable, like the government wants. I think that there will be some accommodation because it's a matter of survival for the party and party rule to make those concessions. So I think that things will develop in a way that doesn't look like democracy as we know it, multi-party and so forth, but could resemble much more a rule of law, responsive government over time. It's going to take quite a lot of time, and right now they're in a delicate position. Now, I haven't been fair to this side. Yes.
How dangerous do you think the housing bubble is in China right now? Are they in a similar position to where we were in 2008?
There's nothing else to invest in China, really, as far as I can see. That's why the prices have gone up and up and up, and a lot of people are being squeezed out, and a lot of people are very unhappy about that. Where the where the weakness is not so much in the housing market, but in the banking system that finances all of this. And while Chinese banks seem to be different from other banks and have been accused of being simply dispersing agents for the government, they do have to balance their books over time, and they do have to manage risk. And you have a lot of provincial banks and provincial banks that are heavily overexposed. But, you know, the stock market is really more like a horse race. People gamble in the stock market, but they make money in real estate. And it's the only tangible thing that they really know. So my guess is that it's going to continue to hold, although there may be some banking crises which shake the economy in the coming years. Yes. Who?
Thank you. Harry Langer, we're engaged in sort of an economic warfare with China. Not only is she eating lunch, but she's eating breakfast and dinner. They're using, as you pointed out, they're using their trillions in reserves to buy up raw materials and resources all over the world, and, which is I consider a great danger, using their sovereign funds to buy into high-tech startups and corporations in the United States and elsewhere in the developed nations. They don't want to be a low-tech, they want to be a high-tech country so they can have the...
is this a question, or is this one of your tones?
What's your view on the sovereign fund investments in the high technology area?
The Chinese have a hard time innovating. And I don't mean innovating, bundling innovations together and so forth and creating things out of them, but I'm thinking of what I call eureka innovation, the next big thing, what someone works out in his garage that somehow transforms the whole world. It's not happening in China because the place is so competitive and so crowded, and that you don't have the freedom to fail. And in order to have real innovation, you have to have the freedom to fail, and you have to have freedom of ideas, free flow of ideas, and neither of them are there. So the Chinese are trying to overcome these problems by getting other people's innovation and doing it, adopting it themselves. And it gives you the impression that they are copying our stuff and eating our lunch and so on and so forth, but there are a lot of people who are in big innovative companies in America quite happy to have the Chinese share in our technology, knowing that we have the ability to innovate and to invent the next big thing. But the Chinese have coined a lot of phrases that relate to innovation and relate to innovation that's adoptive innovation. In other words, taking other people's technology. But they need to move up the food chain in terms of their economy, and they're doing it. And we are actually, in many ways, benefiting from that. And we'll continue to do so.
Ambassador Platt, thank you for a most illuminating presentation. Maybe we can continue the conversation over drinks. Thank you very much.